which widely accepted historical fact is, in reality, entirely false. Marco Polo brought noodles to Italy. In his writings, he compared different noodles to different shapes of pasta, so his readers must have known these pasta shapes. Ninjas dressed in all black to stay stealthy in the night or something like that. Ninjas dressed like normal people to blend in. The all-black look stemmed from Japanese theater to make it more obvious to the audience who the ninjas were. That Johnny Appleseed was a poor, benevolent wandering hobo who planted apple orchards across America so that people would have access to healthy fruit. In reality, he was a wealthy, calculating businessman who was planting orchards to make hard cider, and he was doing so to keep up with the westward expansion, so he was always staying ahead of the curve. He was also an eccentric who would walk barefoot and used a cooking pot for a hat. That part of the myth is actually true. William Howard Taft never got stuck in a bathtub. It was slander by his political opponents. George Washington's teeth were mostly horse teeth and human slave teeth, not wooden. Marie Antoinette never said "let them eat cake." Nero did not fiddle while Rome burned. He wasn't even in the city when the fire started and returned immediately to coordinate recovery efforts. The fiddle myth was created after the fact by politically motivated optimate propaganda. This is a reminder to fact-check everything you see on the internet and not just assume it's true. Paul Revere did not make the midnight ride alone. There were several others that rode around alerting the militia men of the coming attack, including possibly a teenage girl, but there's some controversy as to the validity of that story. The reason we know of Paul Revere and not their other riders is because his name was easy to rhyme within a poem. Napoleon wasn't actually short. He was of average height, but pretty much all of his generals were tall, so he seemed short in comparison. People in the Middle Ages thinking the earth was flat. The Irish famine was caused by a failure of the potato crop and subsequent lack of food. In fact, the potato crop failed throughout Europe, but only in Ireland was there a famine. The famine was caused by a perfect storm of inhuman English laws and practices designed to market capitalize every square inch of the country, forcing Irish people to adopt a subsistence diet. Also, we were shipping literally tons of food out of the country while the famine was going on. William Howard Taft never got stuck in a bathtub. Also, General Custer's entire army did not get wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Custer split his army into three, and only the group that was with Custer was wiped out. The other two groups were not. That Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan had the hands of the workers who built the Taj Mahal amputated. A lot of Canadians seem to think during the War of 1812, it was Canadians or British colonials at the time who attacked and burned the White House. It wasn't. It was a regiment from Britain who just came from battling Napoleon in Europe and were in Bermuda until they were dispatched to attack Washington. Einstein failed math class. Medieval people were excessively dirty. They were no more or less dirty than the people who lived 1,000 years before them. Ideas around not bathing to help protect against the plague would come in the 14th century and last for hundreds of years after the medieval period, making the Renaissance people who put the boot into the medieval people arguably more dirty than the medieval period. Benjamin Franklin flying the kite that was struck by lightning. In reality, his son was flying the kite and he was taking measurements. The Dark Ages, where everyone lived miserable lives, science was heresy, and you ate dirt or starved. It's mostly a Victorian-era myth of medieval life. While things weren't always rosy, they weren't unlivable. People were generally as intelligent then as we are today, and the church invested heavily in science, especially architecture and farming. Also, this ignores the fact that places like India and the Middle East were experiencing a bit of a golden age. Chastity belts were not imposed on married women by their husbands to ensure fidelity. In fact, they were worn voluntarily as a defense against rape, typically by women whose jobs made them particularly vulnerable, like those who were innkeepers or who had to work with or around soldiers. Henry Ford did not invent the assembly line. He just perfected it. It was actually first done by the company who made the Ruger .22 about 20 years before Edit My Bad. After more research it started with the cotton gin. Case in point, do more research so you don't look like a fool. Rosa Parks wasn't sitting in the front. The alpha male theory. That packs of wolves are led by the singular most powerful individual in the group. In reality they are a family unit that care for their members with strong social bonds where the main leading individuals are the breeding pair. I've always highly respected Fred Rogers. I was talking with someone and he said, "You do know Mr. Rogers is the best damn sniper this country has ever seen. He was a Navy SEAL who killed thousands." He wasn't, but people still cling to this. Napoleon didn't use Egyptian monuments as target practice, and the fact that this is in the new movie makes me not want to go and see it. George Washington and the goddamn cherry tree. A lie which is supposed to be a story about not telling lies. The Pilgrims came to America to flee religious persecution. They were religious extremists of their time, and they only came to America because basically everywhere they went in Europe was too progressive for them. The pyramids were not built by slaves. We have the attendance logs that prove that the builders were free workers. Gladiators often did not fight to the death. It was bad for business to lose your best gladiators. Normally they fought until the other conceded or was just out of commission. The to-the-death fights were fairly uncommon or reserved for fancy executions. They certainly happened, but not to the extreme that we tend to think. Imagine how fast the boxing industry would collapse if every match was a death match. America voted on a national language and it was almost German. English won by 1 vote. Totally false, but I've heard it so many times. Captain Cook discovered Australia. A Dutch captain called Willem Janszoon did, then sailed home to tell everyone the news. Girls were not commonly or routinely married off at 12 or 13. Child marriages were typically only for royalty or some nobility. The median age for marriage and first pregnancy has been 1922 for much of history. Disco never died, it was just embraced by a different community. Pyramids were built by slaves. Despite its reputation as the Alamo of the Pacific, the Marine garrison on Wake Island didn't fight to the death, but ended up surrendering after a tenacious defense. The Japanese did execute several of the defenders, including the crew of an artillery piece that managed to sink a Japanese warship. Since the prisoners were effectively cut off from contact with their families, the US used the story of a fight to the bitter end as a propaganda tool for the remainder of the war, and it's still taken as fact by many to this day. The idea that what happened to ancient Mayans is some sort of mystery. I'm a historian of Central America, though I specialize in modern Central American history, and I was raised in Honduras, and we know what happened to Mayans and what led to what some perceive as a mysterious collapse, including mysteriously abandoned cities. And yet Americans remain mystified by this, though thankfully nowadays this is less misunderstood than when I was a kid. It's a long of nonsense. The Mayans existed and exist today, and their civilization never collapsed, it changed. Actor and presenter Troy McClure is not sexually attracted to fishes. That Cleopatra was some sexy seductress whose only thing to her name was her looks. Christopher Columbus wanted to prove the world was round by getting to the East Indies by sailing west. In fact, this fact was known for thousands of years. He was actually trying to find a shortcut and was so bad at math he undercalculated the size of Earth, again another fact known for 1,000 years. He then proceeded to pillage the islands and became a scourge. That fact is not in dispute. Catherine the Great did not have sexual contact with a bull. It was a lie made up by her enemies. Polish cavalry did not charge at German tanks in 1939. Those weren't the droids they were looking for. That the American Revolution was because of taxes. It was a three-legged issue: taxes, debt, and land speculation. Napoleon wasn't actually short, he was an absolutely normal 5'6'7". Thomas Edison didn't do half the shit he's credited for. White settlers gave Native Americans smallpox ward blankets to try to give them the disease. There is only one documented case of this ever being discussed, and no real evidence that the plan was executed or effective if executed. The murder and rape of Kitty Genovese by necrophile serial killer Winston Moseley was not witnessed passively by 38 people. Several people who did witness the stabbing reported it to the police. It would come to light that the New York Times exaggerated and lied about detail. The theory of the bystander effect has been largely debunked today. Marilyn Manson's rib removal so he can suck his own peen. Christ was born while his parents were in town to pay taxes, and somehow that was in December. Contrary to the myth, tax time was in the spring like it is now. The early Christian church was obsessed with driving membership numbers up by recruiting pagans. So they reassigned Christ's birthday to match the rebirth of the sun god, a few days after the shortest day of the year. George Washington did not admit to chopping down a cherry tree. It was an anecdote invented by his first biographer to demonstrate his uncommon moral character. He had to invent it because there are no incidents from Washington's actual life to demonstrate a moral character as uncommon as that. Napoleon never shot the nose off the Sphinx during cannon practice. The nose was missing way before that, according to drawings and historical documents. Bulls don't get angry because they see red. During bullfights, bulls just get annoyed when the matador waves the cape in front of them. It's just that the cape used by the matadors just so happened to be red most of the time. Like Marie Antoinette saying, "Let them eat cake." So many fake history facts in the comments, it's wild. That the French are cowards and didn't fight back at the start of World War II. Cleopatra looked like Liz Taylor. Much of the dispute between the Catholic Church and Galileo. That people thought Christopher Columbus was crazy for thinking the world was round. The ancient Greeks had proven the world was round, and calculated the circumference reasonably accurately. People thought Columbus was crazy because he claimed the circumference of the Earth was half of what the Greeks had calculated, and that he especially wanted to sail out into the ocean and die. The only reason he and his fleet didn't turn back or starve was an undiscovered continent about halfway to China. The broadcast of War of the Worlds caused widespread panic. Che Guevara. He was a drug dealer and a terrorist. The Jews didn't build the pyramids. Historically, we know the Egyptians built them because they actually left pretty good records of who worked on them. Also, the time that they were slaves doesn't match the time they were building the pyramids. Aliens are more believable under current understandings of history to have built the pyramids than the Jews. Not knocking them, they built many beautiful structures, the pyramids just aren't one of them. Charles Darwin discovered evolution, when in fact Alfred Russel Wallace printed his paper first. Einstein failed high school math. He had mastered differential and integral calculus by 15. George Washington did not have wooden dentures, they were actually made from a combination of animal and human slaves' teeth. Julius Caesar never spoke his famous "et tu, brute" line. If he did say something to this effect, he would have said so in Greek, not Latin, as that was the language himself, and most other Roman nobles spoke at the time. That William Wallace wore a kilt. Kilts were not introduced for a few hundred years after his death. Almost everything about the Alamo. I was confidently told in middle school 2000-ish that Marilyn Manson had his lower ribs removed so he could blow himself. George Washington Carver invented peanut butter. He in fact did not invent peanut butter. He invented a stabilizer, kept it from separating and made it easier to use as well as more shelf